You're all set, Allie?
Yes. Can you not see me? Yes, I'm here.
Okay.
Yep.
All right, I'm going to get started. Welcome, everyone. I am Amanda Palumbo. I'm an AmeriCorps member serving as the Forestry Outreach Coordinator for the Vermont Woodlands Association. For those of you not familiar with the Vermont Woodlands Association, we are a member-based network of woodlands owners and managers from around Vermont. We work to educate and advocate for the stewardship, use, and enjoyment of our private forests through programs like today's webinar, walks in the woods, and full-day workshops. You can learn more about our programs and find other upcoming events on our website, vermontwoodlands.org. Before we get started, just a few logistics. The webinar is being recorded. Your mic is muted, but we do want to hear from you. Please use the chat to ask questions during the webinar. You're welcome to turn on your video, but remember we're recording the webinar. The webinar was approved for 1 SAF continuing education credits. And to get credits, please complete the Google survey at the end of the webinar. And this is our climate forestry series, a monthly webinar series where we discuss climate change, mitigation, and adaptation. 1 second. This is our Climate Forestry series, a monthly webinar where we discuss climate change, mitigation, and adaptation with field professionals. I'd like to introduce our first presenter, Ali Kasiba, UVM Extension Assistant Professor of Forestry on Introduction to the 12 Steps of Climate Resilience.
Great, thanks, Amanda. And thanks everyone for showing up on a well, I guess it's not that nice out, so I'm not pulling you from like great skiing conditions or something like that. But I appreciate everyone coming in and listening to a talk about climate change and resilience. So this is a work that I've done over the last year or so, and it's in collaboration with Vermont Woodlands Association, Vermont Department of Forest Parks and Recreation, and the Vermont Tree Farm Program. And so just to set the stage, we're talking about climate change. I'm sure this isn't, groundbreaking news, but to provide some data and background for everyone, the climate is changing here in Vermont and globally, and this is bringing more uncertainty to the future conditions of our forests. So we've seen in Vermont, this is statewide, we've seen about 3-degree increase in our temperature, our annual temperature, and we've seen about 9 inches increase in precipitation over that same time frame. And so what does this mean for forests? Well, there are some benefits here in the Northeast. We are a cold limited ecosystem. So this actually means that we are seeing that trees can grow more, or trees can store extra sugars because they have more time to photosynthesize. We've seen about 3 weeks lengthening of the growing season, but it also means some other changes. So this can mean like insects can have more generations per year, insects that feed on leaves or maybe the wood of trees, or they can grow larger. And we all also are concerned of what we call phenological mismatches. So if things change really quickly, maybe different parts of the forest ecosystem change at different rates. So one example in that lower right corner is a basswood tree that has insect bee-pollinated flowers. And so if bees or other pollinators emerge at different times from the flowers, those flowers might not be pollinated. And of course, we are also seeing with this earlier start of the growing season, things like more spring frost. And for those of you that were around Vermont on May 18th of this past year, we received a severe freeze event, actually. And, leaves had come out fairly early. And so we saw a number of species suffered damage. And so this was, ornamental plants and food crops, apple trees, but also a lot of our native tree species like American beech and our oaks, sumac, etc. And of course, this winter is a good example of this. We're seeing that the conditions are milder. And one way we can see this change, and you'll know this if you're a gardener or farmer, are plant hardiness zones. And so these are the expected minimum winter temperatures at a certain location. And historically, Vermont has mostly been a zone 4, zone 5, maybe zone 3, even in some of the parts of the Northeast Kingdom and high elevation places, of course. And the projections are pretty dramatic when we look into the future. And, keep in mind, these are projections and there's a lot of uncertainty in this, but a pretty substantial increase in the plant hardiness zone. So now we're looking at, 2070 to 2099, which, to be fair, is a number of decades away. Vermont is a zone 6 through 8. And to put that in perspective, that means species like southern magnolia or pecan could technically survive in those zones. So that's a pretty dramatic shift in a short amount of time. Milder winters don't just affect trees and plants, they do also affect insects and diseases that can be pests of trees. So one example on the left is hemlock woolly adelgid. So this is tiny little insect. You see it with that white fuzzy flocculence. It's a covering on the insect, and it feeds on hemlock needles and can cause mortality. We're actually seeing the first mortality of hemlock woolly adelgid in southern Vermont. Luckily, our very cold winters have kept hemlock woolly adelgid limited to the southern part of our state, and we're not seeing a lot of expansion. And the concern is when we see warmer winters, this winter is an example of that, we may see this species march northward into places that it currently doesn't exist. And of course, we also see in milder winters, we get more rain, we maybe have shorter duration of the snow period, less snow, and we see things like this photo on the right, which is, a forest that has no snow cover. And snow is really important, acts as an insulative blanket on our forest soil. So it actually protects. Those are little fine feeder roots you see there. Sugar maple in particular has fairly shallow feeder roots, and these are the roots that trees use to get nutrients and water. And so they can actually be damaged when there isn't as much snow because the soil freezes and goes through freeze-thaw cycles and can freeze deeper than it would with that snow. Snow is also really important as a water source in the spring when our trees are leafing out and becoming active. There is also projection that we're going to see an increase in number of hot days, so hotter summers. Right now, we don't have a lot of hot days. This is using a metric of greater than 86 degrees Fahrenheit. Of course, down by the lake, we have more, and down the Connecticut Valley. But the projection in the future is that we could see an increase in these hot conditions. And what this means for trees and forests, mature trees are generally okay. They'll sort of hunker down in these conditions. But the concern here is when we have hotter, warmer air temperatures, we actually can have more evaporation of water from leaf surfaces, from soils. And so this can cause soil drying, can even cause drought stress when it's coupled with lack of precipitation. We even have this new term that's coming in called hot drought, when we have lack of water plus these really warm conditions. And we can see effects on plants and trees from this. And it's especially stressful to our small little seedlings that have shallow root systems and really can't tap into those deeper water resources. And another example of a climate change that we're really seeing in Vermont recently, and this summer was a good example, but also well into this fall and early winter, are heavy rainfall events. And we are seeing an increase in these heavy rainfall events. This is a graph showing number of days with precipitation greater than 1 inch. You can look at it different ways, over 2 inches, 3 inches. We're even seeing those kind of rainfall events happening. And of course, we know that these events can erode soils, right? In our forests, they wash away the leaf litter and expose those fine roots I talked about with the same sort of dynamic with snowpack, lack of snowpack. And so they can actually create drying conditions in the soil after the water has washed away that leaf litter. And in that process, the water can actually wash away soil nutrients. So things like nitrogen, which is really critical, and calcium and magnesium. When we think about our infrastructure, they could clog culverts, drainages, wash out roads, and certainly affect downstream water quality. And, the other kind of expected change too, although it's hard for us to predict these, are more, sort of wacky weather events, more wind, ice storms, wet snow, and these can break branches, knock over trees. The photo on the top right shows some small saplings that get, when we have this heavy snow event, they can actually be sort of bent over, and they might not recover fully from that stress. And so when we think about forests and trees, trees aren't able to pick up and move and go to new locations. So they really either have to adapt to those changes, or what we see is that a species sort of migrate and move around through regeneration. So you need to produce seed, have that seed land in a favorable location, and then germinate and survive. And of course, this has happened in the past when we think about the history of our forests here in New England. 18,000 years ago, we were tundra, so forests did move in, relocate, move around, species relocated, and we have the forests that we have today. The concern really, when we look at this from a longer time frame, is the rate of change we're observing. And this graph really showcases that. So this is showing global temperature change over time. And the glaciers sort of retreated about 10,000 years ago, and you see we were actually in a sort of stable and then slightly declining temperature globally. And then recently we see this really dramatic increase in global temperatures. And if you look at that history, it's really there's no other time we're seeing that rate of change occur. Then when we think about New England, we also have this other complex land use history component in our forests. And it's really this amazing story of resilience in our forests. It wasn't that long ago, 100 plus years ago, 150 years ago, that the majority of our state was cleared for agriculture, for grazing, for pastures, for tilling for vegetable crops and grains, things like that. It's very different landscape we had. The farms, they were gradually abandoned, and trees are a natural land cover. So trees regrew, and we have, this example photo. This is in my hometown, looking out to Camel's Hump. We have this amazing forest that regrew, which is really incredible. And now we're at about 75% forested in our state. But this came with some consequences. So we see that forests that regrew in some of these places, they maybe have a different species composition than they would have in the past. We're seeing stands that maybe are only 1 or 2 species, like the example on the left, very common in our state. We call it old field white pine, a stand of white pine. They're really growing close together. They're all the same age. They are not very robust, vigorous trees. They have very small crowns. So we sort of see this simplified structure, right? We really want to see in a forest a diversity of tree sizes, sort of diversity in canopy. And we do see sometimes there's these degraded conditions, like example in the lower right is an old skid road that wasn't, maybe closed out properly from before folks maybe knew some of the practices to do for putting water bars and preventing erosion. And so these become ways for water to be channelized. We have fairly steep terrain here in Vermont. So that's something the water is going to find the easiest way down. And this is just becoming more and more prominent of an issue as we have these bigger rainfall events. And then, we have things like invasive species. That center photo on the right is showing a floodplain forest with a carpet of goutweed. So there's not a native tree species that's regenerating in that carpet. And so the concern is when we have these kind of conditions is that one disturbance event, one insect, a climate stress that affects those overstory trees, there isn't a regenerating class to sort of take over when those things happen. There's other ecological characteristics of forests that we've sort of lost too in this process. One of those is deadwood. Forests should have lots of dead logs on the ground as trees die and branches break, or standing dead trees. And we see, because our forests are fairly young, or because folks selectively removed dead trees for firewood, totally understandable, we have less of that component. And we now know that deadwood is really critical for so many ecosystem processes. And, another important thing we think about of our forests is how they help us actually mitigate climate change. So we know that our forests actually they sequester and store carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. It's about half of our state's annual emissions when we look at our emissions from driving cars, heating homes, our industry, all that kind of stuff. And that's an incredible benefit, but it is not a guarantee. And we know there are a number of factors that affect this benefit: age, type of forest, management, but really these things like disturbances and stressors. Climate change itself can threaten this benefit. So it's really important we think, proactively about maintaining this benefit in the future and promote resilient carbon. So we sort of have this situation in our state. We have these legacies of past land use. We have all these other stressors forests face, like insects and diseases, and deer browse. And then we have climate change. And so there is a potential in some places, not every forest, but looking at the characteristics of the forest, that we might have situations where they could be more resilient than they are. There are things that we could tweak or help them along a path of greater resilience. And so I'm going to talk about those, because as a landowner, you can make decisions in your woods to reduce these vulnerabilities and advance resilience. And so I'll define those. Vulnerability is the degree to which a forest is susceptible and unable to recover from climate change. And really importantly, is certain forest conditions and disturbances that exist there can make a forest more or less vulnerable. And so it's really important to think specifically about your land, parts of your parcel individually and think about, are there certain things that might make this stand a little bit more vulnerable? Are there management decisions I can make to increase the resilience? And resilience is really what we're seeking with this work, is the ability of a forest to recover or adapt following disturbance or change. Doesn't mean those disturbances don't happen. Insects still come to that forest, but we want that insect outbreak to be less detrimental. So if we have, for example, multiple species in that stand and one insect comes in that affects a single species, the overall impacts will be less. We'll have still a forest that can provide the benefits that we want out of a forest, from carbon sequestration and storage to forest cover, biodiversity, wildlife habitat, wood products, all those kind of things we look to for our forests. And so we've made these resources, and I'll give you a link at the end on where to find them. I just made, this is version 2 of these resources, so there's slight tweaking, wording changes, but these have existed for about a year. So we have a pamphlet that's a number of pages long, and I think we'll be sending a link to these to all participants. And it has a list of resources. Also made these very cute little pocket cards. The idea that you can bring them out in the woods, sort of look at different features of your woods when you're walking around. And then a specific management plan checklist. If you have a forest management plan and you're thinking about, oh, I want to see if this includes climate, talking to your forester, going through it step by step, just made that as an easy way to sort of think about tweaks you could make. So I'm going to go through each of these 12 steps, and you'll see there's lots of similarities, and they sort of build on each other for these steps. So first, really most important, is getting to know your woods. Climate change is not going to affect all forests and locations the same. So it's really critical to be aware and know about things like the species that exist in your forest, the ages. What is the soil like? How deep is it? What direction, what is the aspect of my land? Whether it's north or south facing really does make a difference in the climate, the weather patterns. What past land use happened here? What management? And this might be easier for folks that have owned land for a long time or had it in the family. But if you're a newer landowner, it's a little bit harder to piece what happened. You might be able to find land records, or you might have to do things like look for clues in the woods, such as cut stumps, barbed wire, stone walls, and things like that. And we do have resources. The Reading the Forested Landscape by Tom Wessels is a great book for sort of picking apart those clues. And so thinking about that management, making a map of your woods. If you do have a forest management plan, your forester has likely already included one of these, and there might be things you want to add to it. Really thinking about, features on your property, getting to know where there might be seeps, or certainly things like vernal pools and wet areas, right? Different soil types. You can find a lot of this information online. If you are really curious about getting deeper into, you can even look at what soil types you have. Certainly things like roads and trails. Are there ones that you use actively? Are there ones that you don't use anymore? And certainly things like invasive plants, any sort of stressors you observe on your property is great to note. So after you've gotten to know your land, I really recommend connecting with a licensed forester. So just for folks that aren't, aware, the difference, I know there's a lot of confusion, like what's a forester, what's a logger? A forester is a trained professional that has expertise, variety of forest related topics. There's some foresters that have tons of expertise in managing for wildlife habitat. And in Vermont, it's a great thing that all foresters must be licensed. So this is a licensure through the state of Vermont. And there's a requirement of continuing education that happens every year, a certain number of credits. And so this means foresters are up to date with the latest science that comes from academics and comes from the government on climate change, on carbon, on ecology, and all those newly emerging topics that we've been focusing on. And so, really, regardless of your parcel size and whether you are focusing on harvesting timber or not, really a forester can help you set goals, plan for future. That's one thing the foresters are really good at, is thinking about the long-term implications of different strategies on that forest structure and function. And so some things you can do with a forester can walk through the woods with you, look at different ecological features, forest health concerns. They can help you establish goals and even selecting which management actions might be best for your forest and your goals to increase resilience. They can help you connect you with other experts. Say you do want to talk to someone, a wildlife expert about a specific wildlife habitat, maybe for breeding birds. There are a lot of landowner programs that foresters are very well versed on that can help you cost share some of the work. So those are state and federal programs we have. And so if you're unsure who to talk to, if you don't have a forester, county foresters are a great resource. They're free to use regardless of your parcel size. And so you can look up your individual county's forester. And they're all great people, incredibly knowledgeable about Vermont's forests. So the third bucket, the third step is thinking about your specific vulnerabilities on your parcel. And this is sort of, I would say, the crux, because all the other steps and strategies following this are really dependent on which specific needs your land has, depending on its vulnerabilities and your goals. And so forest vulnerability to climate change is really a function of its exposure. So sort of like, where is it located? You know, are there certain weather patterns that are going to be more apt to occur there? Is it low elevation, high elevation? So maybe heat stress is more of an impact in low elevation. Whereas if you're high elevation, steep slope, maybe erosion is a big issue. It's sensitivity, and this is really dependent on the current conditions of the forest tied into the past land use. And I'll talk about that. And then with that, its ability to adapt to these changes. And so I break this, to make it a little simpler for folks, I break this into 3 strata to look at in your woods. So we first have what's going on in the understory. So this is sort of, you know, from the ground level to maybe, you know, 10 or 15 feet. Then you have the overstory conditions. This is what we mostly look at in our forest, the mature trees. And then I also want people to think about what's going on the ground level, what's going on in the soil and the forest floor, because this really is critical. We think about health and resilience and long-term sustainability of our forests. So I'll walk through each of these buckets to give you some examples of things that you can think of when you walk through your woods, or consider if they are stressors. So the forest understory. So the idea here are these are things that could affect the future of your forest. So we want to have, you know, regeneration in our forest. We want little trees, we want medium trees, so that if those overstory trees are stressed, they die. That happens naturally. That can happen with a disturbance event. There are replacements. And so things that can impede that are invasive plants, especially like really dense populations of invasive plants. That lower left photo is showing barberry. We have a number of invasive plants in the state, and depending where you are, they're more or less of a nuisance. So we really, those dense populations of invasives, ones that are expanding in size, can actually outcompete tree seedlings. They just can't compete in there, and you'll have an understory of just invasive plants. Another issue that can outcompete tree seedlings is beech sprouts. So American beech is a native tree, is affected by a complex that's called beech bark disease. And what happens when these trees get beech bark disease, and we've had beech bark disease for almost 100 years, it causes the beech trees to send up root sprouts. And because of these sprouts are attached to the mother tree or father tree, they can grow really fast, and they create this really dense understory. You see in that photo to the lower photo to the left. And beech is super shade tolerant. It can exist in a very dense overstory. And so it can outcompete any tree that's germinated from a seed. And so you get these monocultures. Colloquially, we call it beech hell, because it can just be this really dense understory of beech. And what it means, you have one species that's going to go through this perpetual sort of decline, because those are genetically the same as the mother father tree. They'll still get beech bark disease once they get to a certain size. So you're never really going to get a forest that has large healthy trees in that condition. And so it does mean that you need to do some interventions for that. So it's either manually removing some of those beech suckers of sprouts, or a combination of manual and chemical interventions. And the idea is to get some other species in there that can get higher and have space to grow. Another issue we're seeing in our regeneration layer, and this is a concern in a lot of parts of our state, is extensive animal browse. It's mostly deer, although we do see some moose browse in places like the Northeast Kingdom. But unfortunately, deer like certain species over others. And so we're seeing in some forests that they'll eat all the sugar maple seedlings or all the red oak seedlings, and they don't like other species. And so there might only be those non-preferred species in the understory. And that has really limited diversity in our understory. And just in general, if you see in your forest that just very few seedlings or saplings, or only a few species, that is a concern, because we really want to have a diversity of species in that understory to prepare for uncertain conditions. And we also just want to have this regenerating class that can take over and be that future forest. All right, so that second strata is the mature trees. And like I said, this is one we most look at, right? But we do want to think about, sort of their vulnerability to disturbance events and other stressors. So, really things to look out for. Do you have unhealthy looking trees? And these are trees that maybe have what we call crown dieback. So the example in that lower left is a sugar maple. Sugar maple are notorious for getting crown dieback, and that usually means something's not great with that tree. Maybe it has root damage because there was equipment that drove over the root systems, or a lack of snowpack that damages the roots. And so if you see one tree or a few trees with dieback, that's a natural occurrence, and there's going to be trees that will naturally die sooner than others. But if you see lots of trees in your sugar bush or in your forest like that, there's a little cause for concern that something is stressing those trees out. Certainly, widespread insect or disease damage is a concern. Again, if insect and disease damage is natural and part of our ecosystem, but what we get concerned with is when we see a lot of trees suffering, because it can be an indication that you're going to have a loss of that species all at once. And again, a diversity of species sort of limits that impact considerably. And then thinking about sort of the spacing and size of trees, we are, when you have forests where the trees are really growing close together, as I mentioned, the Oldfield white pine, we see this commonly. They're similar size, or just one species. Again, that's sort of vulnerable to an event that affects that one species, could cause some issues if something comes through that does. And often you'll see in this lower right image, we have situations where this is a forest, and actually there's no regeneration going on in the understory, and that's actually invasive honeysuckle underneath. So we have one species of not very healthy trees. I would be concerned in that situation. Something comes through, a windstorm, knocks those trees down, and suddenly all you have is invasives. And then the last, as I mentioned, is this forest floor component. So this is things we're thinking of about the soil, the water quality. So any erosion or rutting issues, this is an example of a culvert that got totally blown out. That middle photo is an example of a lack of deadwood, right? So it's a very flat forest. You see lots of leaf litter, but there's not a dead log on the ground. And that, shows me that there was some land use history here, that really it was probably old past, agricultural land. And it hasn't gone through that natural development forest wood where trees die. But that dead wood is really critical for returning nutrients back into the soil. And things like making sure there is vegetation. So trees, shrubs, grasses, other plants around any vernal pools, wetlands, water sources, rivers and streams is really important too. So once you've identified the vulnerability, like I said, that's really critical, because then these following steps are really dependent on, is this an issue in your woods that you should think about maybe fixing or hoping or trying to improve upon for resilience? So the first is we call slow spread and sink water. Although I will say that every landowner should probably prepare for heavier rainfall events in Vermont. That's just something we're going to see. We continue to see. It does depend if you have, steep land versus maybe you have a parcel that's flat, more prone to flooding. So thinking about really your landscape positioning and your soils. But really, we can think about management actions that can lessen the impact of these heavy rain events. And the goal here is trying to keep water in the woods where it can be absorbed by the soil. So that's that whole slowing it down, spreading it out, and letting it sink and absorb. And these are photos I took after the floods this summer. So this is a culvert that is completely useless. And my general thing is use culverts only where they're ultimately really, really necessary. If you don't need a culvert there, they can be a liability, and always upsize. And then the photo on the right, you might not quite be able to tell, but this is water path over the floor of the forest floor, and it brings the leaf litter, twigs, that organic layer of soil that's on the surface. It washes it down slope, and this is something I saw all over throughout forests through the state. And so when we think about things we can do, used to be, let's channelize water, get it off site. We now know that speeds it up, leads to more erosion. So like I said, keeping it on site, slowing it down, spreading it out is really the best course of action now. That on any roads you have, thinking about ways to get the water off the surface, because water is going to want to find that path of least resistance. And if that is the road, that's where you'll have your erosion. And so making sure any drainages you have, culverts, bridges, drainages can accommodate extreme flows, are clear of debris. So this does mean some, regular upkeep, walking around with a shovel and making sure that those are clear to the best of your ability. I really advocate for leaving deadwood in the woods and using that as a free way to slow down water, especially can be perpendicular to the slope. It captures leaves and twigs and things like that. And that can be a really effective strategy. I also suggest to identify some of these issues, go out in the woods immediately after a heavy rainfall event, and you'll see where the water moves and where your sort of liabilities are. So the next is thinking about protecting water and soils. And so, this is really important as we learn more and more about soil, we recognize how important they are. Most of the carbon in our forests, you may be surprised, is stored in the soil. And it's always going to be easier and more cost-effective to prevent damage than try to fix it. Soils take a very, very long time to recover, decades or if not hundreds of years. And so, prevention is really the best strategy here. And so, when we're thinking about anytime you have equipment in the woods, whether you're doing a timber harvest or you have your sugar bush or recreational trails and ATV foot traffic, avoiding wet, mucky areas, as wet soils are more prone to compaction. And once that air is lost from the soil, you can't get that air back in. And so it will really cause some long-term issues. Anytime you have equipment or vehicles in the woods, selecting one of the smallest impact or bringing them when the soil is frozen or dry is really the best way to prevent damages. You can do some things like using bridges, logs, we call it corduroy, where you put logs down in the traveled surface or branches to sort of lift the equipment up, or your ATV to reduce compaction. And just in general, be very mindful around any water sources. That's really where it's easy to cause damage and, of course, affect water quality. In Vermont, we have a lot of old legacy roads that maybe you didn't even use. They were used in the 50s or something like that, that are sort of in the woods, and they might not have been closed out properly. And so that's a really important source of erosion and water channeling that we can really fix with some, water bars and some features that sort of slow down the water. And of course, maintaining vegetation around those sources is great. So the next step is thinking about how to ensure successful regeneration in your woods. And so this is really key. And I think it's something to always be thinking about. I mentioned foresters are always thinking in the future. And part of that is ensuring that you have regeneration, and that makes sure you have a forest in the future. So multiple generations of trees. We do have some issues in our woods in different places because of land use history, as I mentioned, deer browsing, other factors that we might not see a great amount of regeneration in our forests. And so we got to think about how can we promote it so we have that future forest condition. And so, a couple strategies you can use. I should mention, like, these are all, you don't need to do all of these things, right? So thinking about what's the best strategies for you, but things like keeping a diversity of large healthy trees, their seed source. And this was something in the past when folks were logging the turn of the century, we actually went in and harvested the big and best trees. And now we realize we should leave those trees. They are a source of great genetic source of seed and pollen. They're sort of the winners in the forest. They have great form and are suited to the site. So leaving those is really important. And then when we think about regenerating trees do need space and light. And so we'll have to think about manipulating the forest, maybe opening up, removing some trees so we open up some space and light for species. It does depend on what species you're trying to regenerate. Each species has sort of specific needs along those lines. And things like stand thinning is really important. So intentionally thinning out the dense, regenerating class, you can pick the trees that are sort of more healthy, more vigorous, and give more room to them. And so we'll see increases in their growth and productivity when they have more space. And I mentioned things like controlling any competition is really important. One thing that is a hard thing to control is deer browse. And so, some folks are experimenting with putting small fences around selective regeneration. That can be hard. Tops of trees or branches can actually act as a deterrent from deer. And of course, there's, increasing hunting pressure can be a strategy as well. Folks are interested sometimes in planting if they're not getting good natural regeneration. And I suggest talking to a forester before you do that, just thinking about where to source materials and what to plant. So the next strategy is to think about complexity in your forest. And so we know that from a lot of research and monitoring here in New England and elsewhere, that forests with more species and greater structural complexity. So this means trees of many sizes, ages, conditions, gaps in the canopy. So we don't want a sort of uniform canopy. We want sort of it to be variable. We know that they're more resilient to stressors and climate change. The photo on the left sort of shows a very, I would say, not complex forest, right? It's fairly young. The trees are probably similar age. And then we have the photo on the right. There's a lot more complexity there. There's a gap in the canopy. We have different heights of trees, a lot more going on. That photo on the right is going to have a lot more habitat for wildlife species like birds, for nesting sites and feeding sites. And so we do know that things like, it's not just good for your trees. We know that it helps the entire ecosystem. So canopy gaps can limit the spread of pest insects, but also creates these feeding areas for things like bats and birds, right? So it actually can limit pest outbreaks. Of course, allows for regeneration. And then things like this understory, mid-story layer where we have younger trees, not only is that the future forest, but we see that's where a lot of birds will nest. And so those are also birds that are going to be eating some of those insect pests of trees. So it all really feeds together, right? All parts are really needed and integral to creating a healthy forest. So, thinking about ways to create complexity, it's something to talk to a forester about, specifically in your woods, like what are some strategies you could use to create a little bit more complexity. I advocate for folks retaining things like conifers, evergreen trees, and hardwood stands, and vice versa, right? So that's a great way to have complexity in your forest. Retaining old large trees, dead wood, or even creating some. And then thinking about the larger landscape, and this is something that I think is sort of a new concept to a lot of us, is thinking about, like, what does the forest look like in the next parcel, right? Is it similar, different? Maybe there's opportunities to create some differences in your stand that create these stepping stones for species that might need some different conditions. And I am a big proponent of deadwood. As I mentioned, this is often lacking in a lot of our forests, but we do know that deadwood is really integral to forest ecology and functioning. So it protects soils, retains water in drought, cycles nutrients. As I mentioned, it can guard regeneration. And of course, it's shelter and food for, countless organisms. And so, this is sort of a shift from maybe some of our cultural practices in the past where folks wanted to tidy up their woods. We now know that messy woods are good woods. So keeping dead trees and logs where they are, obviously if they're on roads or trails, you'll need to move those. But we can use forest management to actually increase dead wood. So I'll show you some examples of what that looks like. You can actually chop and drop, leave trees, fell trees and leave them where they are, especially ones that maybe are low vigor, are not, something that's valuable. Maybe they're not growing very well. Those are great opportunities to create some dead wood. And, we do want to think about dead wood across different species and sizes of trees. Bigger is often better, but if you don't have that opportunity, that's fine too. And then keeping old trees that will naturally die will be a source of what I call future dead wood. So some examples, this is what girdling can look like. And it's really making some chainsaw cuts around a tree. Usually we do 2. Trees can be surprisingly hard to kill. I've done this on my property. You don't want to cut very deep, right? So you don't want that tree to fall. And make sure you can do this in a place that's safe to do so. So away from a trail or road, place where you're not coming in with equipment in the next 5 years or so. But these trees will slowly die. Sometimes their branches will break over time and you create this, dead wood input. I mentioned chopping drop, low value trees. And if you're doing a timber harvest, ask the logger or talk to your forester about making sure that some of the tops and limbs of the harvested trees are left on site. I mentioned that these are great for guarding regeneration, but it's also great for protection for a lot of wildlife species, slow breakdown of those, the wood. All right, number 9, managing other stressors. So this is, we say climate change is a stress multiplier. So the idea here is that climate change can sort of exacerbate the other stressors. And I've mentioned a lot of these, although I didn't touch on earthworms yet. Since our last glacial period, earthworms are not native here. So any earthworm you see is actually introduced from elsewhere. And earthworms are great in the garden, in the forest. They churn through that leaf litter and organic material faster than our forests are adapted to. So they are a little bit problematic. Not a lot we can do about them in the woods, but just recognizing if you do have them, it's just another stressor that your forest does face. And so, on the line of managing other stressors, sometimes there's not much we can do, but again, like this idea of healthy diversity of trees is really important. Keeping an eye out for changes in your woods for any damaging pests or diseases. Certainly if you have invasive plants, thinking about maybe you can't get rid of all of them, but kind of chipping away at the edges, controlling their spread. Monitoring for animal browse, as I mentioned. And foresters are a great resource. If you have a specific thing you're worried about, reach out to an expert, whether it's a forester or someone else, to ask about, is this a concern? What can I do about it? Landowners are really great reporters of new pests and new issues. So if you see something you haven't seen before, reach out to someone because that's really important. We're always on the lookout for something new that could be introduced here. Next is thinking about what we call future adapted species. So these are species that scientists think are better adapted to our future climate. So generally, and this is a very big generalization, we kind of have a group of what we call like cold adapted northern species and the southern adapted warmer species. And then we're very lucky in Vermont that we have a really big diversity of species and we're kind of at the confluence of these two groups. And so those northern cold adapted species, we think the climate in the future in Vermont is going to be a little bit more stressful to them. And so you can see that's like balsam fir, a lot of our conifers, northern white cedar, white spruce, yellow birch, and our beloved sugar maple. And then our species that are adapted to warmer climates, these what we call southern species, we think they'll probably expand where they can grow. And that doesn't mean we're going to lose all those northern cold adapted species, but they might be more stressed, and they might be limited to some of our colder sites over time. So north-facing slopes and just colder locations. And so this is from the Climate Change Tree Atlas. They create these projected changes in suitable habitat. So keep in mind that this doesn't say that we're going to lose certain species across the Vermont landscape. It just means that, where it's suitable, where it's going to be less, appropriate for them to grow will decline for these species in sort of that maroon. That center box in the yellow is suitable species will stay about the same. And this green box, which is, I might add, a larger number of species, is that we'll see potential expansion of their suitable habitat. And this doesn't include impacts from disease and insects, importantly. So it's just about the climate. I will say put a little asterisk by sugar maple because it is in that suitable habitat projected decline, but there's a lot of sugar maple in our state. So it's a very big population, a lot of genetic diversity. So we don't think sugar maple is going to get lost. Might be more stressed in some of those warmer sites. And so, I think there was some messaging about sugar maple was all doom and gloom, and that's not necessarily the case, but keeping in mind that it is very sensitive to low snowpack. It doesn't like really warm summers. So some of those warmer sites, it might be more stressed. So thinking about in your woodlot, in your forest, favoring trees that are what we call built to last. So they have good structure. In a windstorm, they might be able to survive, or ice storm. If you have a warmer site in the state, maybe favoring those species you're seeing coming up in your woods that are more adapted, or doing some management activities that sort of promote species like oak or pine or hickories. I'm doing that on my property with red oak, where I see it coming up, which it is creeping into my northern hardwood stand, is promoting it as a diversity of species and a future climate adapted species. And this is true if you're planting too, really thinking about, is there ways, if I am planting, can I include some of these future climate adapted species? What's really important when we think about climate change, we also are facing a biodiversity crisis. And this is really due to habitat degradation and loss. And forests are really critical for biodiversity in our state. We are losing forests every year in our state. And, as we lose it, we chip away at that habitat. We have seen things like bird abundance has declined, and rusty patch bumblebee has not been observed in our state for a while. And so, I really encourage folks to think about long-term planning for their property. There is a new program with Vermont Housing and Conservation Board that Vermont Woodlands Association and Vermont Coverts are both part of. So it's a free program to help forest landowners with land planning. So I encourage folks to really think about, how is their land protected? What's the future of my land to keep it forested in the long term? And certainly if you have certain characteristics, qualities, plants, natural communities on your property, protecting them and keeping them intact is really important. And thinking about, are there ways to enhance some of that habitat for certain species that you may have already or want to promote? And the last step, really important, everyone should be doing this regardless of the other strategies that you use on your property, is keeping track and sort of changing and reevaluating, because we know that climate change is going to bring more unexpected events. We can't, prepare for everything, but keeping track and noting changes is really important. So find a way. It doesn't have to be anything, super technical, whatever works for you, but just having a way to keep track of things you see, stressors that occur in your forest. Outcomes of management is really important. Photos can be a good way to do this. There is a lot of growing amount of resources and technical assistance, UVM extension, but also a lot of other landowner groups, the state of Vermont, or even outside Vermont, are providing lots of help for foresters and landowners and thinking about climate change. Having a forest management plan, even if you have a small parcel, is really important. It helps you consider long-term plans for your woods. And then thinking about, maybe things didn't turn out the way you expected, reevaluating and adjusting your plans over time as needed. So just to sort of end with showing those 3 resources, we'll be providing links. The management plan checklist isn't quite quite complete, but it should be very shortly. And so we'll make sure that you all have access to these. As far as the pocket cards, those will be available a number of in-person events this spring and summer through VWA, through UVM Extension, through our partners. So keep an eye out for opportunities to get those. And there is a list of other resources on this pamphlet too. So it brings you to a link tree that has lots of other things you can explore. I will also plug, if you go to my Extension Forestry site, I have a lot of other resources that I didn't touch on here, including information on forest carbon if you're interested in those. And here's a QR code that you can just scan, and that will bring you to the Extension Forestry site. And my email, always happy from hearing from folks. So like, please reach out if you have any questions or follow up that we don't get to, but hopefully we have some time for questions, and I'll open it up and stop sharing.
I don't think we have any
Any
questions in the chat right now, but if anyone has.
Looks like Ron has a question.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, feel free to ask, Ron. Hi.
Thanks. Hi, Ollie. I noticed that maybe everybody on the call might benefit from being connected to the 4 series that you published. Could you provide a link to those? Or
Yeah, yep, I'll pop that. So that is that QR code, but I'll pop that, I'll pop the direct link into the chat. Yeah, thanks for asking about that.
Yeah.
And I will say, I'm also, good plug, Ron, but I'm also doing another year of articles for Northern Woodlands, and that will be specifically on climate change. So that last year's were all on carbon. So the first one should be published any moment, I think. And that's on sort of like a little bit more in depth of what I started this presentation with impacts of climate change on forests. But then there'll be a series on sort of management for resilience and adaptation, future climate adapted species, sort of a lot of these topics I talked about, but in a little bit more detail.
And this is just to answer Tom's question. This will be posted on YouTube, and we'll send a link out with that within a few days.
Yeah, there's a question about, you don't need to buy the pocket cards, those will be free. We have grants to cover those. So no purchase necessary, but we're just gonna do those. First of all, I'm adding a link to the Forest Carbon series, and those are free. You can access those on my website. For the pocket cards, those will be given out at in-person events. So hopefully you all are signed up for Vermont Woodlands Association's, what do you call it, e-newsletter. And so that lists events. And so we'll have some events. I say they, with me in collaboration, have some events this spring and summer. They might be hosted either by me or some other partners we have, like Audubon Vermont really is going to be using the cards as well. So there might be opportunities with different groups to go to an in-person event and get these cards. So that's how we'll be disseminating them. We actually haven't printed them right now, so we don't even have them physically to give you.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm in the Northeast Kingdom, and I notice in our direct towns near us, there's been some significant clear cutting, like all the trees are cut down whole, hilltops, sides of hills. Is there anything that can protect some of that land? I have a friend who her property is right in the middle of all that, and she's totally surrounded by clear cut, which is probably going to ruin her farm. I guess that's privately owned land, so there's nothing that can be done about that, but
one good step would be first figuring out who owns the land. Sounds like it might be owned by a industrial owner.
It is.
Or
It is.
TIMO, which
Yeah.
those are sort of investment opportunities where maybe not always, like a family forest landowner has sort of a long-term vision for the forest. And so finding who the landowner is would be helpful. Yeah, and if you can find that out through your, town office, there is the Agency of Natural Resources if you're savvy with online maps, they have online mapping, the ANR Atlas, which actually does show land ownership is great. And so then I would say, you know, your Conservation Commission can be really helpful. Your county forester would be a really helpful person to reach out for, because they probably know who the landowner is and their management on that parcel. And so those, I would say those would be good options to look at, you know, for next steps.
Yeah, okay, great, thank you.
All right, Bill Gunther has a question on beech leaf disease. So I didn't mention this, but we do have unfortunately a new issue for beech. I feel so bad for beech trees because, like I said, they've suffered from beech bark disease for such a long time. We have a new issue, and it's actually caused by a nematode, which is, you know, not a very common issue to cause sort of these decline symptoms, but it gets into the leaf. And, you know, I don't have a photo to share, but it creates a sort of like raised areas in the leaves that they kind of are raised up from the surface of the leaves and look really bumpy. So if you see anything like that, helpful to take a photo and send it to the state of Vermont through VT Invasives. And we have detected beech leaf disease in Vermont. It is in a lot of our nearby states. We think that it's probably moved by birds naturally. And so that does make it a little bit harder to control. Right now, there isn't any control options. And so we're just monitoring it. And, you know, Bill specifically asked about whether trees will be killed. And yes, we are seeing in Connecticut and Massachusetts, places that have had beech leaf disease longer, the trees are dying. It actually affects the smaller trees first. So the understory, and then sort of spreads up to the taller trees. So we really don't know what the dynamic will be in beech forests, but there is a lot of concern that the combination of beech bark disease with beech leaf disease could be really problematic. And I mentioned beech hell is a problem for regenerating species, but beech is a really important species in our forests. It is, you know, a very long-lived species that exists pretty much everywhere in our state, and it has a really important food source for wildlife as well. And so, you know, we'd hate to see beech be decimated from that. So keep your eyes peeled for that. And there are some webinars that have been offered by Vermont Forest Parks and Rec Forest Health Team, as well as some federal employees on beech leaf disease.
All right. We have any more questions? I think we're just about out of time. All right. Well, thank you, Allie, and thank you everyone for joining us today. There's a link to a short survey in the chat that I'll also be emailing to participants after the meeting ends, along with a PDF of the 12 steps that Allie highlighted today. We also hope you can join us for our next webinar, The Impacts of Climate Change on the Forest Supply Chain, on February 21st at noon with Dr. Steve Bick. Weather permitting, there will also be a correlated site visit to a logging site to see some of the challenges loggers deal with firsthand. Date and location for that will be announced closer to the date with respect to the variable weather conditions. Additionally, we're hoping to host more landowner walks in conjunction with our climate webinars in the future. So if you're a landowner and would like to offer up your land for a couple hours one afternoon for a landowner woods walk, please get in touch with me or Kate. And you can email me at amanda@vermontwoodlands.org. And yeah, I'll be in the chat for the next 10 minutes. And so everyone has enough time to fill out the survey. Just pop that in there one more time.
Yeah, thanks everyone for attending, and have a great rest of your day. Yeah, and reach out, yeah, if you have any follow-up questions or anything. Take care.
Great. Thanks so much, Allie, and well
Yeah.
done, Amanda. Nice
Yeah,
job, team.
nice job, Amanda.
Thank you.
You did it. You're done your first webinar. Nicely done.
Thank you.
Well, thanks for a great presentation, Allie. It was hard to
Yeah.
stay behind the scenes, but I appreciate everything you put into it and all the information you shared, and a lot of great resources that you've been working on and we've been doing in partnership. So look forward to getting them out into the hands of folks this coming season.
It was excellent, guys. Thank you.
Yeah,
Everybody.
thanks for joining,
Ron.
Ron.
Yeah. See you now.
Great.
Take
Have
care.
a great day.
Bye.
So Amanda, I just hang out for a second and let folks, looks like folks are kind of signing off. Hopefully, they'll head over to the link, and yeah, great job. How you feel?
Cool.
We can stop the recording too. That's probably a good idea.
Okay, yeah.